how lovely to see you. How are you today?
I'm in extremely good form, and how are you?
I'm great. A little bit nervous because anybody listening in will recognize your voice as the original host of the speaker show. So I feel that I'm now, I'm interviewing the expert, the man who basically set up the speaker show for success and got the listeners in. And then I just took over the baton. So thank you so much for doing that.
Well, you've taken on to greater heights, so thank you.
Well, it helps when somebody set you up for success. I tell you, it makes a huge
Very kind.
difference. So I'm honoured to have you as the expert today. And let's get to understand a little bit more about you. So in the introduction, Sean, I refer to you as a foresight strategist. If anyone doesn't know what that means, what is a foresight strategist?
Well, as they always say, so all titles are utterly ridiculous when sort of stated in public. You know, if you're outside an advertising agency or major brand owner, then talking about one's title always sounds ridiculous. So one of those. But I mean, basically, my background was that I spent 10 years in advertising and research, working with very sort of cutting edge agencies over here and in the States and elsewhere. And then I set up as a consultant with my partner, who's at the BBC at that point. And so for the last 20 years, I've just spent, a lot of my time, to put it mildly, working around the world, or now mainly online, conducting research, interviewing fascinating people. I used to do a lot of ethnography across Asia, States, Europe, Middle East, North Africa, etc. And so I think by linking that sort of thing with dare I say it, hopefully sort of attempting to have a sort of a slightly cerebral view on things by linking in with, great authors or journalists or the political think tanks, etc. If you try and mix, which is what I try and do, if you like, the street to the boardroom, then one has to think of some sort of, quasi ridiculous title to sum it up. And so foresight strategist, that'll do me.
I like that, street to the boardroom. I think that's really good. I've written that down. I'm going to remember that. Really good.
Because there's just such a disconnect, isn't there? I think we all see this. And again, it's to state the stunningly obvious. We'll hear these sort of comments, literally constantly when one is talking with, particularly board members or whatever, that they just have lost connection with reality, to put it mildly, in terms of, if you like, consumer reality. How many people who are running, major brands actually experience the consumer reality on a regular basis? And the answer is still a absolutely minute amount. I mean, those sort of, if you like, criticisms were made back in, no doubt, 1920, but one of those, plus a change. So I think it's just really, really odd how there's just such little clear connection, so little, as Interbrand used to say, clarity, consistency between the two. It's extraordinary.
You're absolutely right. It is extraordinary. So tell me, Sean, how did you get interested in this area in the first place?
Purely because after being in agencies for so long, and I'd always specialised when I was in agencies in youth culture, so I used to do a lot of work, let's say in the entertainment world and the music industry, etc., fashion. I still do quite a lot there because I've lectured at Central St Martin's and London College of Fashion and elsewhere for the last 20 years on sort of social and cultural trends. And again, I think it was that issue. I used to write for a lot of magazines, I still do. So back in the day, for those like The Face and Dazed and all the rest of it. And so doing that, then I used to trend edit Viewpoint, that was then, probably still is, one of the best, I dare to say it, sort of best trend magazines there is out there. I sort of set up the Future Laboratory, which I think is still, one can safely say, one of the best trend agencies, if not the best in the world, run by the mighty Martin and Chris. And so I think it's that issue, say, of having if like trying to explain the complicated in a reasonably simple fashion, from the point of view of saying, okay, well, here are the emerging trends. This is what's happening in terms of consumer behavior. This is what's happening in terms of, corporate and organizational behavior. Where's the disconnect? Where are the tension points? Why are things falling down? Why are so many brands still not really delivering what they should be delivering? It's something that puzzles us all. So
Absolutely. And actually, you've written about this extensively. You've written two great books, and I want to go into these. Well, they're award-winning books. You've done very well. So I want to talk about the first book, The PostTruth Business, shares how to strengthen consumer engagement by closing the brand credibility gap. I had to read that to get it right, because I don't want to get it wrong. I think you've sort of alluded to this already, but what is this brand credibility gap and why does it exist?
Well, you'll see that credibility is integrity. Brands are judged by how they act, not what they say, to state the stunningly obvious. And yet still, as we see, most brand differentiation is still wafer thin in most markets, at most levels of those markets, etc. And so I think, what really fascinated me for years was that you couldn't go to any event, you couldn't go to any conference, you couldn't go to any workshop, any, dare I say, ideation session or whatever, and not hear someone say, authenticity, the dreaded A word, very, very soon. What always amazes me is how few people ever stopped and actually stated what they understood by what authenticity actually is. So, like almost every other major word, all the words everyone uses in ad land or in marketing land or in strategy land, they all have, I think, a fairly clear definition or an accepted definition in a sort of Wittgenstein type sort of a conception of language. But authenticity always seemed up for grabs. And so that's why I sort of had that at the front cover of my first book, which luckily went to #1 and all the rest of it. And so there I just took a look at, naturally, when we talk about authenticity or things like sort of trust and truth, you have to go back to the ancient Greeks. I spend half a lot of my time talking about philosophy and psychology, and so I'd look there. Okay, so what is it that Aristotle was telling us, about authenticity? How can we understand authenticity through the philosophers through the ages? So be it either Iris Murdoch or Sartre or Rousseau or whoever, Hegel, etc. And if you understand, if you like, in brand terms, in organizational terms, what it is that they were articulating, what it is that they were suggesting, I think that often helps you to get to a very clear place of actually understanding, okay, who are we as a brand? What are we really about? I think there's a lot of confusion in brand teams about really, genuinely, who are they? What is the organization really there for? What is the background of it? What are they to do? And that helps them to reconnect with the consumer, drive differentiation, and have a bit of clarity. So essentially the first book really linked up those issues of truth and trust and transparency, privacy, which is now obviously a huge sort of existential issue, particularly at a time, and I wrote that back in 2017, when Trump had just come to power, and where notions of fake news and disinformation and misinformation and deep fakes were suddenly really, really hitting the headlines.
It's interesting what you say, because you would think it's quite simple to be clear on who you are, what you stand for, what you do, and yet it's so difficult. Why is it so hard for brands to get that right?
It's bizarre, isn't it? It's one of those age-old questions, I think, that drives most people in most organizations mad. And it's quite odd how, if you talk to, within reason, any good marketeer, any good strategist or whatever, any good planner, any good researcher about, okay, so who's doing this well, they can come out with a great list, but they say, right, so what have you actually done? And they fall down. There's still, I think, it's one of those great jokes almost, one of the great truisms of the event world. You can't go to an event. No one's been to an event in the last decade where someone hasn't mentioned Patagonia. It's almost like playing bingo if you're in the audience, like who's going to mention it first, and yet so everyone generally agrees Patagonia, a wonderful organization, superbly set up and run. So they all talk about them, and you say, okay, so now that you admitted you really admire them, what have you actually done, if you then meet the same people 6 months later, to perhaps mimic some of what they're doing, to take a lead from what they're doing? And no one does. It's just, it amazes me, or very few people do in a decent way.
I do love the idea of having conference bingo before you
conference
go.
Bingo, yes, exactly. You heard it here first. There we are, Mary. We can do that between us. And
yeah, Christmas idea, right? Have we got time? It might be a bit tough. So tell me, you cited, that people give examples and they say people, getting it right. Have you got any examples of individuals or brands that get it right?
How many hours have you got? I think to this, and to be actually, deeply serious about this. The image for me of the year, the dreadful image of the year, were those people falling off planes taking off from Kabul airport. A dreadful sight. Those images flashed around the planet. That terrible day, and those terrible days. What was interesting to me was then saying, okay, so once one had sort of like gasped with horror, it was very, very soon that Airbnb jumped in and said, right, using that sort of analogy, and said, right, we're going to house 20,000 Afghan refugees. Bang, do it. Taking what has to be said, if you like, an approach from perhaps Rousseau, so Rousseau really talked about acting with passion, doing the right thing, not overthinking things. I think a lot of strategists, perhaps to answer your question in a roundabout way, a lot of marketeers, a lot of brand strategists, etc., overthink things and almost talk themselves out of doing the right thing, because I think it's perhaps an occasion too obvious. Whereas Rousseau said, act with passion, do what feels right. And so there we have CEO of Airbnb saying, clearly, these poor people need assistance right now. Let us not have 50 meetings about what we could possibly do and then, put it into our sort of, business strategy for the year. He just said straight away, I'm the CEO. We're taking 20,000 people, make it happen. I think that for me is just like, bang, the conversation almost ends. So a fantastic example of an organization doing something that is relevant to them. And relevance is key. People talk a lot about, the dreaded word purpose, which I think is often, really little more than, as the agency RGA would put it, toxic pomposity, and actually really saying doing something relevant and useful in the world is what brands really should be about. And that is, I think, is an absolutely amazing example of a brand stepping up to be counted.
I like that. Relevant and useful, but also not to overthink it, to actually, act. I totally agree with you. There's so much overthinking that goes on. And then, the more you think, the more likely you are not to act. Great. I love the quote about purpose too. That was brilliant. So your second book is very, very much looks to the future, doesn't it? Influencers and Revolutionaries. And again, so on topic and on theme and relevant to the time, because we're all seeing influencers and revolutionaries at the moment. What are some of the trends you are actually seeing for 2022 and beyond that you're sharing?
Well, actually, that, and has to be said in terms of its sort of timing, probably the book that was released with the worst timing of all time. It released about 2 days before the first lockdown. And so it's booked into, I think, 800 airports around the world for airport bookshops, just as everyone stopped flying. So one of those. So it's reviewed very well. And then luckily this year it was shortlisted for Business Book of the Year, but one of those tragically didn't get it. One of those. But I mean, what I did there was, and actually, to be bluntly honest, I did it deliberately from the perspective of the speaking world, to say, okay, what are the big meta themes in conference land, if you like, and let's write a book around that. Hence, literally just doing chapters on, the future of retail, the future of cities, future of homes, future of food and drink, insurtech, fintech, and all the rest of it, and really sort of building up a picture of, okay, in each of those, major categories, who are some of the key players? Who are the legacy players that have been there for a long time, and perhaps in a sort of Christensen way are now having the innovator's dilemma in front of them? But who are the startups? Who are really sort of who are the new people in town who are really shaking things up? So the book looks at a whole range of different categories, different sectors, and all the rest of it. So
Fantastic. I mean, we haven't got time to go through all of those sectors, but I've got some areas that I'm curious about. So I wouldn't mind asking you a couple of questions and picking your brain. Well, I mean, we've seen a lot of change obviously through the pandemic with regards to how consumers consume. How is consumption going to change in the future, would you say?
The epic billion-dollar question. I think it's interesting to me how Mr. Joe Pitt, CEO of Unilever, is saying that it's clear that some behavioural change is here to stay, and so the likes of Unilever have seen certain obviously owning brands across a multitude of categories. As I stated a while ago, if you basically operating in the hygiene space, if you're in the trust space, if you're in the home space, if you're in the caring space, then quite frankly, on a purely bottom line, cold-hearted business level, you've basically cleaned up. We know, looking back now, to state the obvious, that certain categories, certain brands and categories have had what can be, again, coldly put, a very good business version of COVID, because they've been necessary and relevant, and they have performed and all the rest of it, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. I'm very sort of pro-brand. There are others naturally that have had a dreadful time. We've seen whole categories, whole sectors having an absolutely appalling time. Tragically, as we know, things like the world of live music, the world of theatre, etc. One really worries about players in those sectors. So it's really interesting to me how we have this, as people often will say, an almost dual reality going on. I think it's interesting how what has been one of the growth areas over the last 18 months, quite frankly, has been the world of therapists. It's amazing. If you talk to psychologists, they are just booked solid. And why? Because we've seen now this being played out by things like, when we talk about the future of work, the big term at the moment, obviously, is the Great Resignation. People are just, are looking at the world of work, they're looking at their employers, and they are not satisfied with what they're seeing. They want to do something differently. We've seen in terms of the world of architecture, in terms of the future city, the future home, the move to, as Richard Florida, the great author who put it, who wrote, Rise of the Creative Class. And I remember being with Richard down in Melbourne years ago talking about this when we were at a very big event. The idea of moving out of primary cities to secondary cities. The impact has been huge. Again, that has linked into things like clustering, the idea of donut economics, the idea of the 15-minute city. All of those things, I think, have been perhaps could have been looked at a year or so ago as being either slightly unworldly and utopian and fine for a few but not for the many, are actually now clearly happening. I mean, Deloitte will say that what we've seen is the feature on has been given a rocket boost over the last year or so. We've seen so many trends speeding up like mad, and quite frankly, many others slowing right down or going away. To finish your question very quickly, 18 months ago, if we'd been having this conversation, you and I would have no doubt talked about something like the sharing economy. The sharing economy was in every event one went to. This is where it's all going. Nielsen doing a 60-country study saying this issue across demographics is exploding. And what has happened during COVID, we've seen that the idea of the sharing economy in most sectors totally stopping still. So it's been very interesting to see how certain areas have sped up, others have stood still, and others have basically dissipated.
No wonder we need therapy, isn't it, really, when you think about it, with what we've been through in such a short period of time. You're so right. It really has. Things have accelerated, the world has changed dramatically, absolutely dramatically. You've touched on so many areas. You mentioned so many areas. One of the areas I'd like to focus a little bit more on is the workplace, because at the time of the recording, we're disrupted again. People are being asked to work from home.
Yep.
And you mentioned the Great Resignation, and I'm sure this whole disruption of work has had a huge effect on that. What do you see as the next development in the workplace, would you say?
I think the big thing in the workplace, and it's almost not actually say the next development, but it's an ongoing thing. And again, it's part of this dual reality we're seeing, which is on one side when one is, as one could argue now, at work, emoting whatever, promoting oneself through a screen, which is what most people in most, business meetings or whatever are doing. We know that, for instance, one of the things that is very clear is it's exhausting. To do this for 8 hours a day is mentally shattering, and we've seen that the impact on people's mental health, just on something as basic as living on Zoom or Teams, has had a hugely detrimental impact. It's really interesting to me how many talks I'm giving now, as no doubt are many of the speakers that are on the Speakers Associates books, because I'm fully aware, having interviewed lots of them, that there are some brilliant speakers out there, and good luck to them. But what I think is really interesting is how the amount of events now being called in by the HR department, I think, has exploded. The idea that a lot of the major big brand owners are saying, it's sacrilege, but within reason, the brands are now effectively okay. They're running themselves or whatever. The problem they have is with the personnel. particularly the younger personnel, the ones who, again, as we're seeing now, people going back into the working from home or increased working from home again, people who we're social animals, that particularly that age group need to be around people. They need to be in that collegiate atmosphere, and they're having real problems in terms of their mental health, dealing with this ongoing, as The Economist and the Washington Post put it, the stop, start recovery. It's incredibly irritating, to put it mildly, for most people, for businesses, and it's also has a really, really negative impact. So I think a lot of the, if you like, the future of work issue is around building in resilience, building in strategies to literally to explain people in everyday language how to build hope. The difference between hope and optimism. Why the skeptics and the cynics were right, and how you can use that sort of thinking. And the problem, I think, there is that, to finish it off very briefly, when one is having, if you like, the usual people one would go to talk about this, the therapists, the psychologists, etc., they tend to talk, as do philosophers, in incredibly heavy academic language, which for most people is fairly unintelligible. So you have to be able to re-articulate what those super bright people think without trashing it in an ununderstandable way, which is, I think, a lot of what certainly what I'm doing now, and no doubt what a lot of the other speakers are doing as well.
Wow, gosh, we've got a lot ahead of us, haven't we? It's fascinating stuff.
There we are.
So tell me, you obviously work across all sectors and industries. Your work is relevant to everybody, as you said. You were talking about the future of so many different areas. Which are the organisations and which are the sectors that are getting it right at the moment, would you say?
That's a real killer question. So start first of all with the other way around, the ones that are getting it wrong. I think it's fascinating how the world's most fabulous industry, fashion, has been getting it wrong on almost every level now for several years. They were quietly trying to sort of creep their way along, and then people like the wonderful Extinction Rebellion, that the sort of a protest movement, linked up with a couple of years ago when they started, really took the fashion industry on, absolutely center stage on the catwalk, saying, actually, if you look at the carbon impact of the fashion sector, if you look at issues, as we've known for years, around issues around ethics and morality, and Naomi Klein talked about this back in the 90s with her Epic But No Logo, and I interviewed Naomi for the Face magazine. Wow, just remember that many years ago. So I think this issue of sectors that are getting it wrong are really, really clear. I think they're very rarely talked about in a, if like, in terms of brutal, simple reality at events, because people don't like to talk about that in a gathering. They want a, if you like, a more positive message. But one can certainly point to businesses and organizations that are doing things well. And again, I think a great way of looking at this, to come back to putting it forward in a way that is just not as simple as Googling good brands, which obviously anyone can do. Again, one of the problems is that most audiences are totally able to read the latest trend reports themselves that they get from their agencies, so there's no need to repeat all of that. But if you look at it, let's say, through the eyes of a philosopher, let's say someone like Iris Murdoch, when she would talk about, when she would allude to the issue of authenticity, with so many brands being obsessed with being authentic, she was saying the key point that is missing from a lot of that authentic sort of obsession, which can be quite sort of inner focused and all the rest of it, and very narcissistic. She'd say it's all about empathy. Are you genuinely caring and thinking about the other? Because if you're just thinking about yourself, your personal brand, or the organizational brand, and then you've got a real problem. And empathy is something that for years was looked at as being a bit weak, a bit liberal with a small L. And actually, what have we seen during COVID? Those brands that stood up to be counted, those brands that almost back on. We all remember the first month of COVID when. Or COVID, let's say, in Europe and North America, when there was a great, let's say, a great lack of face masks, and there was a real concern about this. A brand like Melita, the German coffee brand, just realised that their coffee filters were the same shape as a face mask and just retooled the factory to make face masks, So again, doing something relevant and useful that was needed, doing it straight away, again, taking that Rousseau approach, acting with passion, not overthinking things, absolutely fantastic. So I think, again, it's been really interesting how this sort of behavior has been noticed. We've seen, again, just stunningly obvious that the incredible importance of local community to communities around the world, which is linked into local retailers and all the rest of it. So that idea of people needing one another, all those basics, social animals, needing to nurture one another, look after our neighbors, look after the elderly, look after the lonely person in the street, applauding the health services around the world, all these sort of shared things show us something. This is important. This is reality. This is what people need and like. So I think a lot of it is just literally going back to look at things from a really clear-minded, street level way to say, okay, what do people actually need? How are people actually living? What is it that brands have got to do to actually be useful and relevant, as well as being attractive and all the rest of it?
So here's a challenging question for you, because you attend a lot of conferences and events, and I listened to that answer in depth there that you gave me. Do you think that brands, when they have their conferences and events, do you think that they're challenging their status quo, challenging what they're doing enough? Are they going far enough? Are they thinking, far ahead enough? Mm-hmm. Would you say?
I think not at all. I mean, to be bluntly obvious, and I mean, that has to be said, the elephant in the room, I think, is that it still amazes me how few events one goes to are genuinely challenging. If you go into let's say into a strategy meeting, into a planning meeting in a good agency, then you'll tend to have really hard-hitting, in-depth, well thought through, research-based, reality-based discussions about the problems that the brand perhaps in question is facing. What are the real tension points? What have we got to be sorting out here? Where are we tripping up? And yet, if you go to most events, or certainly most events I've been to the last 20 years, most of them tend to be, I think, a bit of a parade of quite comfortable views. A lot of them that are, in many cases, almost exactly the same as every other event. We talk almost jokingly about, playing event bingo. I wouldn't mind betting that, if one was to go to, 50 events and noted down the key points that are being made, how many of them are identical? Now, if they're identical and being useful, then great, but I wouldn't mind betting. And I certainly have the impression that most of them are fairly lackluster, has to be said. So I think to answer your point, I think the sharp thinking that takes place in really good planning departments and strategy departments on the brand owner and on the agency sides tends not to be as replicated as clearly and as brutally simply in most big events. And I don't understand why.
Okay, well, the challenge has been laid down here.
There we are. There's a challenge for 2022.
We've got a new game and a new challenge. How's that?
Yes.
That's amazing what you can do in 25 minutes, isn't it? Incredible. So finally, Sean, because obviously you look to the future, what's next for you?
For me personally?
Yes. And your business, you and your business.
Yeah, well, I mean, literally, I just finishing off my current project. I've been working on a very interesting project, doing research in Beijing and Shanghai and Seoul. So I've just got to finish that off over the next few weeks, and then more talks, more business school talks, which I do sort of a lot of, just looking at, again, where brands are going next. More agency talks, doing another big one for a big sort of global PR agency next week. Obviously, like this, I do a lot of my own podcasting, so a lot of that in terms of talking with, I interview a lot of activists and, again, psychologists, philosophers and journalists about sort of where they think things are going. And as with all these things, we all shamelessly steal each other's ideas, as should be done. Nothing wrong with that at all. Karl Popper, the great Karl Popper, always said one should be constantly refreshing one's thinking. Criticism is good. Look to the other. As Kant said, people fool themselves, they know everything. They certainly don't. So one of those. So I think sort of mixing and matching interesting thinking is what it's all about. And certainly, yes, that's what I'm attempting to do.
Lovely. I love that. Interesting thinking. That's brilliant. And of course, we will be on the side working on our new conference bingo game. So you watch out for that. Fantastic. Sean, thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed being on the other side of the mic for this particular podcast. Thank you so
marvelous.
much.
Thank you indeed for being, as always, of course, the wonderful host. So brilliant.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening to The Speaker Show. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts. You can keep up with future episodes at the Speakers Associates website, which is speakersassociates.com, or your favorite podcast app. And if you would like to invite Sean to challenge your audience at your next conference, and I highly recommend you do, please get in touch with Speakers Associates in plenty of time to book him so that you won't be disappointed. Anyways, bye-bye from me. I will see you all next week. Thank you.